What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the Josh Button Podcast 2026. We're back. Took a couple months off, and we'll get into a little bit of why in a few minutes. But here to introduce himself, because you can do a much better job than I can, is Dustin Lebel. And look, I came across your page just because my algorithm blessed me. We're both purple belts in jiu-jitsu. We're probably getting into the same age range. I might be a little bit older, but I know that you are addressing many of the real challenges for being a midlife combat athlete, a midlife hobbyist, a midlife competitor. And honestly, your page is it's full of gold mines, and it's full of things that will entertain thinking differently for most people and also remind us of, not giving up on some of these things as we do get into midlife training. So Dustin, thanks for joining me. First, tell me about yourself, how you got into both training, your area of expertise, and jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me on, Josh. I greatly appreciate it, and I'm glad the algorithm worked in both of our favors this time around. Yeah, so I'm a strength and conditioning coach up in Connecticut right now, or for the last 8 years. I work completely online, but prior to that, I worked in a facility for 12 or 13 years and had every role you could imagine, ranging from working with Gen Pop elderly to elite athletes, getting ready for the NFL Combine and everything in between. So served a variety of roles there. And as far as getting into my own training in terms of martial arts, I started my first jujitsu lesson, not to date us here, was back in 2003. So I'm a purple belt in jujitsu, but I've been training on and off for over 20 years now, with a good chunk of that being off due to injury. And I started back up at age 36, a little over 4 years ago, and I just have made it, an important a part of my life ever since. And I love working with this population of people, or other combat-based athletes, particularly uh, midlife combat athletes, which is kind of scary to say out loud, but just because I relate to that person, I am that person, and I just have a soft spot in my heart for people who they love the martial arts, they want to continue to train them for hopefully the rest of their lives. And, we just need maybe a slightly better or more sustainable approach in order to do that long term. So that's where I stand on that.
Awesome, brother. So likewise, I too am incredibly fond of the community, and obviously jiu-jitsu, what it provides us, it's not something that you can really understand if you haven't had your hands and feet on the mat. If you haven't put in the time, you haven't engaged the discipline, and you haven't actually made it through some of those injuries and stayed out there and stayed active, you just don't know what it's actually doing for you. So I in this podcast, it was originally health and wellness, and I've kind of shifted my attention towards our community
Mhm.
specifically. And there's a ton of experts out there, but literally, if you look at it right now, I think just now we're kind of birthing this community. I
For
think that
sure.
the whatever we want to call it, midlife jujitsu hobbyists, midlife combat athletes, because a lot of us are competing, is growing. And we knew we really need to know how to take care of ourselves, how to train for this, and that's where you come into play. So I want to pick your brain. I want to pick your brain specifically. I've seen so many things on your Instagram, and I know that you offer this to your clients in coaching. But today, how do we fill in the 35 to 45-year-old guys with some information that'll lead them back to your page where they can follow up and then perhaps hit you up for some one-on-ones?
Yeah, so I guess as an overarching perspective in terms of how I approach coaching, my principles are first and foremost is taking a long-term sustainable approach. So, it's not always the flashiest, it's not always the most attention grabbing, although maybe I'm getting better at using hooks or whatever on Instagram. But for the most part, if you read the actual content of what I'm delivering, it's very much based on logical, practical approaches towards long-term training, right? So, your average 35 to 40 or 45-year-old plus athlete, we're not professionals, in terms of we're not professional athletes. We train as a hobby, even though it might be a serious hobby. We might, some of us might compete, at a local level, or if you have aspirations of competing at like Masters Worlds or whatever, you do it as a side, right? As an aside, to your real job, your family, whatever else you have going on in your life. So, but it does play a really a very important role. Like, I think not only from the health aspect of, you're physically active, whatever, however many days a week that you train, and you're taking care of your body, or hopefully in terms of, nutrition and strength and conditioning and all these other things to maximize your time in the mats. But, I think one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough is just the social aspect, right? Of having a place to go to with a bunch of pals and from different walks of life that you probably otherwise would never hang out with. But you have this one kind of thing that brings you together. And I think that's just really understated and really important. So I think if we can keep that in our lives for as long as possible, I think we're going to live longer, healthier, happier lives. And man, it just adds so much to my life that I know how important it is to me, and I know how important it is to other people. So I take that kind of like 30,000-foot view, if you will. And, when I'm looking at what are the things that we can do to, whether it's to not optimize that time on the mats or necessarily maximize, but get the most out of it. It's partaking in some sort of strength and conditioning program 2 or 3 days per week. And I'll get into kind of my thoughts on frequency and why that kind of matters. And then, utilizing an approach that allows you to train all physical qualities ranging from, we'll call it like speed and power on one end to, strength on the other. And then also we're looking at, building capacity and conditioning and being able to, replicate that on the mats, right? And we're also looking at, make sure we taking care of ourselves in terms of overall recovery or load management, however you want to word that, so that we're not just smashing ourselves with training every single day of the week, but we have some sort of undulation, whether it's easier days, full rest days, recovery days, built into an otherwise busy schedule. And then, the other kind of elephant in the room with a lot of us is that we have other things going on, right? So it's managing training and the stress of training with the stress of life and our full-time jobs, families, other obligations that we might have. So it's kind of looking at the whole, the holistic part, aspect of all this, putting everything together to come up with a plan that's both agile or flexible, but also rigid enough to continue to make progress long term. And we're not just completely I won't say you're messing around, right? I was going to say the F word. I don't know if we can swear on this, but we're not completely, going off and just kind of doing random, chaotic things. We have a plan, a structure, and we're going to get to where we want to go.
So you have a 2-day per week blueprint. I saw that post and I was like, this is great. This is because a lot of people think about training and specifically for strength. And I think that's what most of the guys in our age range fall into. The first initial trap is, oh, I got to go to the gym and I got to lift heavy 3 times a week or 4 times a week, or otherwise I'm not going to keep up with these kids. So let's debunk that. Let's get your perspective on that first and foremost.
Yeah. So if you take your average, and I'm not using this word disparagingly, but like your average hobbyist, right, who's in the training jujitsu 2, 3, 4 days a week, maybe more, sometimes less, depending on your schedule. They already have that stressor in their training. That's like the main piece. So let's say your average person trains 3 days a week, hour each time. That's, especially if you're getting a good amount of live training in, live rolls in, like that's a lot of demand on your body. So to add more strength and conditioning on top of that, it needs to be done with kind of like a fine tooth comb, if you will. It has to be done in a way that allows you to still make progress, both at the sport and now these physical qualities that you're training for, but without kind of burning all your matches. And now you're left, at the end of the week, barely, instead of barely surviving your week, I always talk about it in terms of like, I want you to repeat the week, meaning you complete a full microcycle or 7 days of training, with your 1 or 2 rest days. And afterwards you should feel like, oh, I could totally handle that. I can handle maybe a little bit more. And that's the dangerous part. I'm always like, just because you can handle more, that's perfect. That actually means we are doing the right things. Let's just repeat the week, and be able, let's find a sustainable plan. So that way, in 6 months from now, 12 months from now, hopefully decades from now, we're still repeating the week, and continuing to make progress in training and enjoying our training and not dreading what we're doing.
Yeah, so I think I've witnessed it firsthand that sometimes people fall into the trap of wanting to do more so often that they will actually go above and beyond what their body's capable of recovering from, and then find themselves in that community going, do I need to supplement or do I need
Uh,
to take cycles? Let's be
yeah.
honest. A lot of
Yeah.
guys in our age range are going ahead and jumping on testosterone, whether or not their doctor provided it or said it was probably something that they needed to get into, but just because of the way they feel on the mats with the young kids. So do you attribute the same thing like that happens a lot of the time because they're not recovering properly?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of not just not recovering, but a mismanagement of expectations. You know what I mean? Like the 22-year-old phenom blue belt who competes at in the adult division and is winning medals, they are just not on the same planet as you right now in terms of what else they have going on in their lives, the time available they have towards training. So we have to look at it from that, which I know is like a hit to the ego. Like we want to believe that we can be that guy, but it's like, the meme, you're not that guy, pal. Like, which is fine. Like, accept who you are. You can sometimes hang with that person, but sometimes not. Like, and that's cool. I think that's part of life. Like, you got to kind of be able to move on to a degree in order to appreciate kind of what you're still able to do, right? But then we have this aspect of people just having zero idea of how to train. They're either haphazardly putting together plans or following programs from other high level athletes who you don't know if they actually follow them or what supplements they may be using, or they're not doing any strength conditioning, or they're just completely like inconsistent with it. And it's like, man, if you just had a plan to follow, were consistent with that plan for the next few years, I think you'd be surprised at how far, you can go in terms of improving all the athletic qualities we want to improve, but also, managing recovery, managing total training load, and feeling not like 10 pounds of shit in a 5-pound bag. Excuse me. But it's the idea of recovery also, 2026, the whole I think one thing the whole recovery aspect of training has probably been a little bit overhyped for the last 6, 7 years. You have a lot of the podcast doctors, everybody's talking about whether it's HRV or ice baths or sauna and all those things. Those are fine. But recovery is a systemic process that is not dictated or governed by one thing, but is a total body process of all the different inputs and outputs that you have. And I think the more people understand that, the more that they gonna understand of like what you're actually capable of handling on a week to week basis. And you can titrate things up over time and be able to handle more over time as you build capacity. But for most of us at our age, we're limited or constrained by time mostly than we are probably recovery, if we're being honest.
Right.
I just do not have the time to train more physically than what I have. So, yes, I'm managing your recovery, but it's more of just making sure I go into each day feeling the best I can relative to whatever happened the previous day versus trying to necessarily be like 100% optimal about everything. And I just kind of let those cards fall where they may. And I advise most clients to do that as well.
All right. So I guess my introduction to your page was that you had the free 8-week program on it and it was gassed to ready,
Yeah.
which I just put myself through this. And I had a super fight at the end of January and I accepted it end of December. But right after I accepted it, I got hit with this head cold, the actual head cold version, and head and chest congestion and cold. And it took me, I mean, it put me under for a week. So it kind of zapped my cardio right away. And I was at the time I wasn't sure. I was like, is this really going to affect my cardio for the entire time up till this fight, or
Mhm.
will I be able to regain where I was at and then train for it? And to be quite honest, I didn't have any issues with this one particular thing. But when I saw your page, I was like, bro, I could have used this 8 weeks ago. So I thought it'd be really interesting is if people were to go to your page now, take that free 8-week program, and then let us know what the results are, specifically you midlife rollers out there who go and really want to see what your gas tank is capable of. Do you find that guys in our age range can really increase their gas tank off the mats with their training really well, or is jujitsu cardio just specific to jujitsu?
That's a great question. So let's get back to, I guess let's first talk about jujitsu specific conditioning and maybe dispel some myths, right? So first and foremost, the work that you do on the mats is obviously going to be most specific towards, well, getting better on the mats, right? So there's no replacement for that. Understanding tactical, and technical aspects of the sport, along with pacing strategies and really just the gamemanship that goes into, again, whether it's competing or just rolling live with your buddies, that is first and foremost going to be the most important thing. However, again, a lot of us are constrained by time, so we're maybe not professional athletes getting in. I was listening to I forgot who it was, and she's a really high level black belt competitor. She was talking about her training schedule, on Stephen Kesting's podcast, and it was like 6 days a week, multiple sessions per day, and it was like upwards of, I want to say, 10 times. It was like almost 100 rounds of rolling per week. It was something, and I don't quote me on that, anybody, but it was absurd, right? It was a lot of volume, and she could handle it. She was still doing conditioning off the mats, by the way. But that's the extreme end of the example. Most of us just aren't training that much, so we need the additional supplemental work outside of it. Not only that, but when we're talking about jujitsu specifically and what goes into that, because jujitsu is so chaotic in the sense that, we're not just moving, we're not just running right in a cyclical manner. We're grabbing, we're pulling, we're gripping, we're exploding one moment, recovering the next moment. It's not like a stereotypical cardiovascular activity where we're able to just express output for a given amount of time, recover appropriately, express output. It's like it's all over the place, which is great. That's part of the sport. But if we really want to enhance or maximize the adaptations that we need in order to better facilitate, being better at jujitsu and being having a better gas tank for jujitsu, we need to do work off the mats. And one of the things that I kind of touch on briefly in the PDF that I put out, and I don't go too far into it just because it's a free PDF. People aren't there to read a bunch. They want just give me the program and I'll follow the program. But I do touch on this a little bit. And it's the idea of the different adaptations that we get when we do different types of cardiovascular training. On one end, we have the more central abilities of your heart, right? The ability of the heart to systemically pump out blood, deliver oxygen to working tissues. And that's like when people think about like your VO2 max, like that's what they're actually referring to is your heart's ability to deliver oxygen, which is fantastic. You need that. You need that base of support in order to, well, just exist, but also, have the capabilities to eventually be able to produce a lot of power, right? And do so in a live, like rolling environment. But then we also have these peripheral adaptations or what happens at the muscular level. And it's so what happens? So oxygen's getting delivered to your muscles. Your muscles then have to extract that oxygen and now put it to use. And that is actually the main limiter in jujitsu, which anybody who has rolled before probably has had that feeling where, like, yeah, you can feel quote unquote gassed and you might be out of breath, but it's actually what's happening at the muscular level that's your main limiting factor. And this has been studied where people look, well, jujitsu hasn't been studied too much, but when people look at like high level MMA athletes or boxers, right? These are the most, in terms of research, these athletes don't have crazy VO2 maxes. They have very, like, even elite athletes in those sports have very average VO2s. It's the peripheral ability where they truly excel. And we're not able to, well, I don't want to say we're not able to, but that's not typically measured as much. So it's kind of like this unexplained thing, but that's precisely what it is. So this program is designed to kind of touch on both a little bit, but it's airing towards the higher intensity side of the different intervals, and I'll get into that in a moment, because it's that higher intensity that's going to allow us to basically recruit those fast twitch muscle fibers and allow that ability for your muscles to, again, extract and uptake that oxygen, put it to use. So you need intensity in order to elicit that. Okay. So that's why we're airing on the intensity side with this, which sidetrack here, over the last maybe 5-6 years, we've heard a lot about like zone two and the popularity of
Right.
zone two and steady state training, which is fantastic. Zone two it's a great way for someone who's relatively detrained or more general population to accumulate the volume needed in order to improve that heart, your heart's ability to deliver oxygen, right? And we're going to get a host of health benefits from doing zone two. I'm never going to discount that or discredit that. However, for your typical combat athlete who's on the mats a couple hours a week, we're already getting training volume there. Now, of course, it's not, like I said, it's not a cyclical modality, so it's not the exact same thing, but time is already of the essence. So I put this program together not to completely debunk zone two. It's not what this is about, or, to completely disregard that. If somebody wants to do additional steady state work, by all means, or your mat time is lower for whatever reason, yeah, get in some extra work. You could use it probably from just like an energy flux standpoint. But in terms of maximizing our time and being more efficient with it, that's why I put this together. So the program itself consists of actually two kind of baseline assessments, intervals based off of those assessments, and then a retest or a reassessment, if you will. Okay. I could stop at any point, but let me know if this is
No.
we're
Please go.
we're
Please
rocking
go.
and rolling. Okay. So I mentioned these two different adaptations. We have central, we have peripheral. We're erring towards the peripheral side with both of these intervals. However, we are still going to get a little bit of the, energy systems exist on a spectrum. So it's not like we can target just one thing or just another thing. You're always targeting everything. There's no such thing as anaerobic or anaerobic. Everything is aerobic. There's no, we're always using oxygen rather. We're also always using lactate. Lactate is a fuel source. It's not, lactic acid doesn't exist, but lactate is a fuel source that our brain uses. And there's various reasons as to why that happens, but just to kind of clear that up. So we have a wind gate assessment. If you do this test, and we're using a simple assault bike or whatever bike you have access to, where we're doing 2 rounds of 30 seconds all out, like as hard as you possibly can, resting for 60 seconds, seeing what your heart does during that 60-second break, and then you're repeating, doing 30 seconds again. Just 2 sets. If anybody's like, oh, just 2 sets, be my guest. Go ahead and try it. I'll wait for you to DM me and tell me it was too easy. And that's
I'm going to go ahead and
yeah, go
I'm going
ahead.
to interject
Please.
one thought real quick.
Yes.
You might understand what he's saying, but if you go and you look at the post, 100% is 100%. It's not holding back. And it almost freaked me out to see your post the first time because I went, I don't think I've pushed myself like that at anything. At anything in a long time. The last couple of times I've actually sprinted, I've pulled hamstrings when I'm just really completely honest with myself. I have a nice good stride and I'll do some field work, but a real true sprint, like I'm chasing somebody or somebody's chasing me, I've felt it the last couple of times, and it's actually been in the back of my head not to do that. So to see you on the bike at 100%, I went, okay, actually, this is something different. This you tapped into something there that it reminded me when we were kids, we did this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You didn't think about it. You just went up the hill and
Exactly. So go on.
Yeah, so I'll get into that a little bit actually. So the reason why we use a bike, whether it's an assault bike or echo bike, or it could be a spin bike, like it doesn't need to be one of those, is it's safe. There's zero learning curve. You just hop on a bike, you push as hard as you can. There's zero mechanical wear and tear. Like, wear and tear is not the word I want to use, but you're not worried about pulling a hamstring when you're on the bike, right? You can go all out. So your brain can literally just shut off and you just do the thing. But we need that all out effort from 0.0 seconds through the end of the interval, because we want to see ideally how quickly you can turn on from a heart rate kinetic perspective, and also just like a peak power perspective, what the power you're putting into the bike. And we want to see like how long can you sustain that for in the case of like a 30-second interval, because as most people find out, they can go very hard for 10, 15 seconds. And then the last 15 seconds are just like, the report back is like, I was going through mud. But we want to be able to see what that looks like. And then during the 60-second break, ideally, if somebody's wearing like a heart rate monitor, and if they don't have one, that's fine. We want to see what happens to their heart rate during that 60-second recovery. And there's an app that I have access to via, and a lot of this, by the way, is from a guy named Andrew Usher. I recommend people check him out. So I did a mentorship with him this past fall, but prior to that, I've been looking at his stuff for the last 4+ years at this point. But a lot of this is from him and a guy named John Babry, who's out of Abertay University over in UK. And they do a lot of research on, well, sprint intervals, but specifically looking at like substrate utilization and how that kind of relates to combat sports and how do we train that, right? So, we're looking at the heart rate kinetics during that 60-second break. And then the repeat 30 seconds is, okay, you did it once. What do you got for that second time? So in the case of my program, I wasn't worried about like people having a heart rate monitor and all that, because you need an accurate chest strap. You need one that can get those fine-tuned heart rate deflections. I'm not worried about people having that. So I have people just looking at their max power and their average power. So if you're on a bike, for example, like an echo bike or an assault bike, you'll get a max watts reading. And then after you finish your 2 intervals, you'll get an average watts reading. And I just use that as a real simple guide in terms of like, I'd say the average watt reading is probably the most important one for our purposes, right? And it's like, let's say you average 600 watts for both week 1 and week 8, you retest, and now you average 700. That's a massive improvement. Shows a very good repeat ability to repeat power. That's our day 1. That's going to be looking at more of that peripheral side, and I'm basing our kind of like higher intensity or sprint interval intensities off of that. And then I do have a more kind of like aerobic capacity based assessment, which is a 2 mile test on the assault bike or echo bike. And that's going to be more of a test of like your heart's ability to deliver oxygen. So we are still looking at that, but it's short. It's, you're done in, about 5 minutes plus or minus, depending on your fitness level. And then I base the intervals for the weeks following that off of that number. So we are getting a good gauge of both. Go ahead. Sorry.
How hard are you instructing them to go in that the first time?
So on that 2 mile, you are going out at a pace that you think is hard but sustainable because I want to make sure it's about it's like if you were to run like a mile, you know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
maybe a little bit faster. And so it's that kind of pace where you're going out like a 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10, and you're just hanging on. And the thing is people will finish that and they'll always be like, man, that was really hard, but I felt like I could have XYZ, right? Like, oh, I pulled back here, I should have pushed her, and that's fine. That's normal. You're still gonna have a very good gauge in terms of like what the intervals should be like preceding that, for the following weeks, and then also like on the retest, so you'll be able to put that together. But generally speaking, because people will always ask, I'm looking for like a sub 5 minutes on the 2 mile. That's like a good ballpark, general fitness range.
And do you retest both of these for metrics every week?
No, well, you honestly, you could, and if somebody wanted to, but in this particular program, no. You could do these fairly frequently though, just because, yeah, they're really hard, but they're not gonna beat you up. And if anything, they can be kind of like a good general weekly assessment built into a program. The problem is most people just won't want to do it because it is kind of soul
Because it's
sucking
hard.
after a while. But it could be just kind of this like litmus test where you go out at like I use rate of perceived exertion, so RPE. You go out at RPE 8 to 9 just to kind of get a gauge. You could do that every single week, and then like let's say you do a 430 one week, and that's an RPE 9. Like you had a little bit left in the tank, but pretty hard. But then the next week you did a 505. Okay, that's a sign that you probably need to pull back. Your training stress is probably high. I'm just using that as an example and to answer the question, but no, for the sake of this program, test week 1, test week 8, and then in the middle, we do our intervals.
Do you find that there's a psychological stumbling block at all with this?
For sure. I think that's when most people, that week 1 will be a rude awakening for most people, you know what I mean, in terms of their ability to push through that. And I think it's important too for combat athletes, especially like the better you get at jujitsu. A lot of times, the more kind of relaxed and laid back you can be, and you can kind of dictate the pace of your rolling, especially if you're rolling with less technical or less skilled athletes, people that are lighter than you. This is your opportunity to push the pace faster and harder than you ever would in your live roll. So that way, when you are matched up with somebody who's just as fit as you, just as technical as you, just as strong as you, now you have the ability to, you know, hopefully outpace them in some way.
So I would say that that's my number one challenge in jujitsu is not only because most of the time I would be going with either lower belts or lighter weighted individuals, but when I'm going against somebody who's obviously better than me, somebody I don't know if you know Wagner Hocha.
Uh-huh. Yes.
That's where I train, and there's a handful of guys besides him, but him himself, when you train with him, you know what you're about to get.
Yeah.
So you're not
Yeah.
going out there to drop 100% in the first couple of minutes. You need to be able to sustain frames.
Hmm.
You need to be able to defend yourself. You need to be able to be methodical and actually hang in there for the we do 10-minute rounds typically. And if you've got a 10-minute round with somebody who's a absolute powerhouse of top pressure,
Uh-huh.
you are not gonna enjoy the last half if you go and you spend it in the first couple minutes. So, I think that's one of the biggest challenges for myself personally is ever giving 100%. I'm holding something back. I'm keeping something in the
Hmm.
tank. And I went out and I did this super fight, and I realized after 5 minutes, I did not fatigue one little bit, but I had more to give and I didn't give it. So for myself, I can see with your program is the one of the biggest challenges is actually giving 100%, even though it's 30 seconds and it's 30 seconds. Giving that 100%, it's not easy.
Yeah. So the sprint intervals, especially where you are at a maximal, or it'll be often termed super maximal level, that's your opportunity to go again above and beyond the pace that you would ever do. Even somebody who's kind of like a faster pace individual, that's going to be that ability is going to far exceed whatever you would do on the mats. And there's some really neat adaptations when you do that. So we're talking about oxygen utilization. That is the primary adaptation that we need in order to facilitate recovery. Not people think recovery, they think like, oh, I rolled 5 minutes, I recover, or 10 minutes, whatever, and I recover between the rounds before my next partner or my next match in a tournament. But we're also talking about recovery between efforts. There's a quick scramble, you recover, or even just the milliseconds in between. That happens again. The better you are at utilizing oxygen, the faster you can do that and replete that using ATP, the faster and more effectively you're going to be able to repeat that same effort level over and over and over again. Now, the cool thing with sprint intervals is you don't need a lot of it. It's 60 seconds of work, whether it's 2 30 seconds, 3 20s, 4 15s, whatever. I mean, in this program, it's just once per week, but it could, you could do them up to 2 to 3 days a week, depending on the rest of your training structure. But it's only 60 seconds. So the ask is relatively minimal. You know, I'm willing to do it because it's only, it only takes me 3 to 5 minutes, depending on my rest intervals, to get the whole thing done. And on top of all the other training that I do, so I do jiu-jitsu, but I also do a little bit of striking, some poor MMA, poor man's MMA, if you will. I need something that fits into my schedule, and I find with a lot of my athletes, this is just a way to interject again, really a time efficient, highly effective conditioning protocol that they're willing to do, sort of, but they definitely feel better, especially give 3 4 weeks in, those adaptations really start firing off, and people start noticing big changes on the mats.
So when I was going through your page and I was thinking along these lines of these interval training sessions, one of the things that came to mind was games in jiu-jitsu, games within training like King
Mm,
of the Hill and
mm.
things where you're not going to be against a 10-minute clock. You are going to be able to do short duration things. And do you believe that that's really important for us to also go out there and maybe do 30 to 60 to 90 seconds of a little higher intensity and train ourselves that way on the mats as well?
Absolutely. I think in terms of sport specific conditioning, that is the best thing. I think the best thing you can do is kind of like you said, mentioned playing these one sided games, being able to manipulate the game in such a way to increase intensity within relatively safe confines. I think that is by far and away the most efficient way to train, in a way to really like maximize your time on the mat. Or even if it's, some people might not have that opportunity depending on the gym they train at, kind of what the class structure is, but you can kind of do that yourself in a way. Like if you put your ego aside, where you have a specific game that you're trying to work on. Your partner doesn't need to know your game, but you decide to work that particular thing over and over and over again. I think that's a great way to kind of manipulate that as well. And that's just again when I think about like conditioning, it's easy. Like again on Instagram, where you're using hooks and headlines and you're trying to draw attention, of course, and then I provide context within the written component. But when we're talking about building a complete conditioning package, the sprint intervals are like that's the smallest portion. That's, the icing on the cake, if you will, versus what you actually do in the practice room. That's going to be the most important. You know what I mean? So yes, 100%. I think that's, the best way. That's why, again, you could do just that and a little bit of sprint intervals. You'll probably be good. You don't need to do much else outside of that.
We also want to get stronger. We
Oh yeah,
also
for sure.
want to keep climbing while we can climb, because inevitably, I think in the back of all of our minds, there is that question of when is it going to stop going this way? When is it going to plateau? When is it going to even start going the other direction? And I think you're preparing people for that if they're not already thinking it, for thinking it. And, good on you for that as well.
I appreciate that. And like one thing that I'm always kind of when I'm programming for people and when I'm talking about strength and conditioning in general, I'm always thinking about like this idea of kind of what you were just alluding to, this idea of physiological headroom, where the decline is going to happen. It's going to happen to all of us. I want to see how high can we push the ceiling before it eventually starts to decline, right? So we can continue to prove these qualities. We're in our 40s or older. I think we can continue to prove these for quite a bit longer, but eventually things are going to start sliding backwards, and like we want to resist that entropy for as long as we possibly can. So that's why it's important to have structure, have a plan, take a long-term approach, but like I don't think it's necessary to put like a ceiling on anything. Like you can push pretty hard for a long time.
Do you train at a traditional Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu academy? Are you training somewhere they're doing ecological? Are you mixing it up?
It's a little bit of a mix up. So I train at it's a traditional jiu-jitsu academy, but it's also like very MMA oriented as well. So there's a little bit of everything. I've so my instructor prior to a few years ago he's by the name of Diego Arujo. He goes by Moreno. He's in Dallas, Texas right now. He trains out of Octagon, or he teaches out of Octagon MMA with Neil Meleninson. And they have a really great program down there. So he's down there, but he was my instructor for several years. Who I got, he, I earned my purple belt under him. And he's, kind of like this mix of both. If I had to phrase that, you know what I mean? And like I think over the last few years, the ecological approach has certainly, come more to the forefront. And I personally use a little bit of both now, in terms of my own training and also just working with my coaches and my training partners as well. So a little bit of a mix to answer your question. And for me, it's just about keeping training fun, but I do learn better under with that type of approach, as opposed to sitting and listening to technique for 20 minutes and then trying to replicate it.
Yeah, I hadn't really heard about ecological when I realized that's what I was doing. I was adopting an ecological approach to playing half guard just to fend off some of the monsters in the room, and it was literally something that I think I found by coincidence, and I just realized I can build some defense here, and just kept putting myself in bottom side control and put myself into half guard and playing from there, and realized, a year or two later, like, oh, I was kind of giving myself a constraint based approach and playing this very specific thing. And it just made the rest of my game night and day differently. So Melanson, I've stolen a good bit of things from him as well.
Yeah.
The Neil knot and a lot of the games that he plays in that half guard are pretty awesome. So strength and conditioning wise, when you're taking a guy who's my age, mid 40s, and he's really got jujitsu built in, but he's going, all right, I'm gonna hit that last approach at getting stronger before I'm thinking about seeing the doctor and seeing if my hormones are right and all of these other things. How do you break these guys into a 2-day a week program?
Yeah. So my typical layout I mean, I recommend 2 days a week to most people. I personally do 2 days a week, three at the absolute most. And that's if your training volume is relatively low, like you're a super hobbyist. You're only doing training jujitsu a few days a week. But 2 days a week is what I recommend. And my typical session layout is shouldn't be unfamiliar to anybody kind of in the strength and conditioning world. But, for a lot of people, it can be kind of novel because they're like, oh, I've never done some of this. But, we're going to start a training session with like, a very brief general warm up, kind of whatever you got to do to get ready. But I don't recommend people spend too much time there. Kind of get right into the session, and I can get into more of that. But and then we're going to start with usually something more on the speed or power end of the spectrum. I'm using the term power, but really we're looking at velocity and moving quickly. So things like jumping, various plyometrics, medicine ball throws, things of that nature. We're going to spend 10 minutes or so there, doing a handful of sets for a handful of reps just to get that exposure. When we do these exercises, we're not trying to get tired. We're not trying to induce a bunch of fatigue. We're trying to get the most quality repetitions that we possibly can. So I might be looking at 10 to 15, maybe 20 total jumps and or medicine ball throw variations. And again, that might take 10 minutes total. Then we're going to move on to some sort of primary lower body lift. I tend to alternate between a squat variation and then a hinge variation. So day one squat, day two hinge. And it's the squat variation that you can perform well, that you enjoy doing, that you can progress over time. So I use that basically as a way for folks to basically like choose your own adventure. For example, if somebody goes to my page, they'll see me Zercher squatting quite a bit. And that is because I tore my labrum 20 some odd years ago. Pretty sure I retore it a few years ago and I just haven't had it fixed. So back squatting is out of the question for me. I literally can't do it. So a Zercher squat where I'm holding the bar in the crook of my elbows feels good. I can squat perfectly fine. I can load that sucker up. So that's my squat of choice, but you choose the squat variation that you want. And then we're gonna do a primary pull, upper body pull. So, weighted chin up, for example, or a heavy bent over row. And usually for those primary lifts, we're gonna keep the volume relatively low. We're looking at maybe around 10 to 12 total repetitions. Whether that's working up to a top set of 5 and maybe doing one back off set of 5, or, a top triple and 2 or 3 back off triples. And these top sets, by the way, are still RPEs, 7 to 8. We got a couple reps in reserve. They're moving well. It's not like get yourself psyched up and slam your
Right.
head against the bar and, could put your favorite song on. It's like you should just be able to go in, hit the set, move on. I use the term, which I stole from a coach named Christian Thibodeau. It's like, don't train on the nerve. Somebody asked me what that means. It just means like, just chill, man. Just hit your main lifts. You can go relatively heavy, but you want to be able to set up for the next session to also be a success. So if you grind yourself too hard today, it's probably going to impact you tomorrow or the following week. So we do our two primary lifts, primary lower, primary upper, with a squat pull one day, hinge press the next day, and then I vice versa. So we do a secondary option, so a secondary hinge, and that might be like a single leg RDL or a bilateral version like a glute ham raise, or it could just be a seated leg curl, whatever. And then a secondary press. So a pressing variation, different from your primary variation. It could be like a vertical press, for example, if your shoulders allow that. Or we're going to vary that up, and I'll tend to rotate those accessories more frequently, but 2 or 3 sets, 5 to 10 to 12 reps in that range, a couple reps shy of failure, that kind of thing. And vice versa on the other day, we're doing a split squat or a secondary squat variation. It could be a machine base, a hack squat, a pendulum squat, what have you, and it may be some sort of row or rowing variation. And then we'll finish with some, core work or other accessories, depending on the person, what they enjoy doing. But we're going to get some trunk rotation in, even though for jiu-jitsu, people think of like resisting rotation, and you get quite a bit of that, quite frankly, when you're doing like heavy hinges and pulls and squats and all that. So I don't really put a lot of that in, but I will do like like heavy landmine rotations or like a bent over cable rotation, something where you can train that trunk musculature relatively heavy. And then, maybe some neck or arm work or just something to kind of top things off. On the other day, I might do like a more lateral flexion, like a side bend, like a heavy side bend or something along those lines. And that's pretty much a structure of like most training days. I'll vary accessories up, I'll vary the rep ranges, but the idea is to be able to get in and get out in about 60 minutes. If you need to put your conditioning post strength training, that should be able to fit right in with kind of my philosophy. But yeah, that's it. That's a pretty typical day.
Do you ever actually build into failure days, or
Not
you
as
steer
much.
clear?
It depends on the movement, quite frankly. For a primary movement, if it happens like accidentally, like you completed a rep and you're like, I definitely don't have another one. That's fine, right? I'm not discounting that. And sometimes you have to go there in order to know what that feels like. 100% agree. For like a more accessory based movement, like if someone's doing a seated leg curl or a bicep curl, go to failure. Push the set, please. I'm thinking more of like a heavy bent over row. You could probably leave a rep or two in the tank and be able to progress that just fine. Going to failure, I think, is a good litmus. It's a good idea of like just to know kind of where you sit. Keeping a rep in reserve is probably best for like long term progression. I think. You know what I mean? I've made the mistake of trying to go to failure every single week, and it's like you just reach this point where you just can't progressively overload anymore. It just becomes more difficult. It's like you could save yourself the hassle by literally just keeping a rep or two in the bank.
So let's talk about recovery then. Recovery days, recovery sessions. You actually had one post on there about apnea recovery day.
But yeah, yeah, yeah. So I, so in terms of recovery, kind of going back a few minutes, maybe 20 minutes ago or so, I look at it as like total systemic recovery. So like your workload needs to matter the most. Like if you're just kicking yourself in the dick every single day and you're training, as hard as you can with no sensibility, then like, yeah, you're gonna, no matter what you do in your off time, like you're probably gonna have a hard time managing that. But assuming I generally recommend at least one, if not two, full recovery days per week. I generally suggest people like don't not do anything if I'm wording that correctly. Like don't just sit on your butt and watch TV and eat all day. Like stay active. I know for a lot of us, like just having an off day can be mentally like a little bit of like we're kind of head cases, so it's like we need something to do. So I had that what you're talking about, this apnea protocol, which is like a breath holding protocol, basically where you're breathing through your nose. I'll try to explain this, but somebody could just go on my Instagram. You're breathing through your nose. You're doing inhales and exhales the whole time. On the final exhale, you're going to get into like a split squat lunge or a split squat iso hold. You're just going to hold that while you're holding your breath. And then when you get that moment of panic, like that oh shit feeling, you're going to breathe again, but only through your nose. Take like 3 to 4 inhales and exhales and then go into the next rep. And the idea here is, because you're in this isometric hold, there's some vasoconstriction going on. You are going to be utilizing oxygen. It doesn't have the same metabolic effect, obviously, as like sprint intervals. So it's a different type of thing. But generally, it's like you could do that for 5, 10 or more minutes. If you're if that's your jam, as a way to kind of like just move a little bit, facilitate some blood flow and feel good. And that's a great option. But generally I recommend just people like today, for example. Today, Thursdays are my one of my rest days per week. I went for like a little walk a little bit before this call. Like just something to keep moving, I think is a good idea. My other rest day happens to fall on a weekend and I got two young kids. So sometimes that's just literally running around with them. Like, and go to sporting events or whatever the case might be for my son. And, you do what you can on those days. But I think having built in recovery days, I'm not going to say it's like a game changer because you can train every day really, as long as you kind of like undulate the stress a little bit. But for me, my like kind of the way I operate, I like having my 2 days of just to chill, and then my other 5 days, and I'm on the mats 3 days a week generally, and I do two strength conditioning days, and that's just kind of the way I operate. Obviously, somebody, if you have a different training schedule, but like what I find people sometimes have trouble is they're like, well, I do jujitsu Monday, I strength conditioning Tuesday, jujitsu Wednesday, strength conditioning Thursday, and they're just like, there's no real recovery built in. And some people are fine like that. I just think if you're struggling, or if you're like, man, I get through a week and I'm just like beat, you know what I mean? Like in jujitsu, especially, like my hands will start to get swollen. I'm just like, I just know it's time for a break. That day tends to just kind of like, push things down a little bit. Like you kind of recover from like an autonomic standpoint. I get like my programming done today, like that kind of thing. Somebody wants to do a podcast, I'll schedule it for today. It's just an easy way to kind of like mix everything into like my life, if that makes sense.
Right. Now, do you do any other breath work, or have you ever done those apneas to get ready for a match or anything? Without the isometric hold, I guess it'd be more like apnea movement and just getting your body used to the.
So I had a coach one time. His name is Scott Hagnes. Everybody needs to know about Scott Hagnes. He's an OG. He's been coaching forever, but he's a guy. He's in his, and I'm not trying to date him. Sorry, Scott, but he's in his mid 50s, and he is just an absolute animal. He's one of the smartest coaches in the entire industry that people need to know about. He doesn't have a big following on social media, but follow him. You will learn something. So I was working with him for a while, a few years back, and he had me doing some different breathing protocols just to work on like CO2 tolerance and kind of that ability to down regulate a little bit. To be honest, I haven't played with it too much since then, other than like maybe I'll do like that apnea protocol. It's probably worth honestly like looking into again now that you're bringing it up. I think it's worthwhile. Just like anything else, you can kind of like overdo it, not in the sense of like overtraining, but those adaptations still like need time to take place. But yeah, I would definitely look into something like that. There's a simple app, might actually just be called Apnea Trainer, where it's a scuba diving app actually, and you can do like a timed exhale, and then it'll give you intervals based off what your exhale was. But yeah, I used to play around with that. I might start playing around with it once again. Do I think it's like an absolute game changer? No. Do I think it can maybe give you a 1%? Maybe. And I think that might be worth it. If anything, it's like a way for like meatheads to meditate without meditating. You know what I'm saying? I think meditation's great, but most of us just aren't going to do it. But if you're like, dude, you can get a training effect by holding your breath, and it's like 5 minutes of just chilling out. I think more people would probably do it. So I guess you made me think about that answer just now, but I think it's a good idea.
100%. I'm a breathwork freak in regards that I've used it for different things at different points in my life, and it's always comes back to being relevant in one way or another. But you're right. I didn't know what meditation was. I thought it was something guru, foo, whatever craziness until I did real actual breath work. And then I was like, oh, I guess I'm kind of meditating. It does make sense now.
Yeah, I think there's that autonomic shift that happens. I think
Yep.
that's always a good thing. That's always a net positive. Whether again, I'm not whether that the effects are overstated by certain people, like especially like in the social media sphere or under, it doesn't matter, but I think it could be a useful tool for sure.
Yeah. So do you train gi specifically only gi or no gi as well or
Man, I'm a gi guy by heart. I love gi. So I'm doing that like 2 days a week, but I do one day of like more MMA oriented sparring and rolling. It's on like wall drill. So I guess there's some no gi implemented in there. Just for the last few years, I just haven't done much of it. No gi, I rather, but I know I need to. Just I need to work on my wrestling, my stand up game, that kind of thing. So yeah, but usually gi twice a week, and then once a week, I'll you'll see me in my rash guard.
Yeah, when you said that your hands would be wrecked after a week long of training, I was like, "Oh, you gotta be training the gi a lot."
Yeah, and I play a lot of guard. Like a guy that I really like try to emulate from a very like, you know, poor man's perspective is Adam Wardzinski. So I love his style and like, playing that like butterfly style, but yeah, relying on grips way more. And, I try not to over grip or anything like that, but my wedding ring doesn't fit anymore. And it's like, yeah,
Nature of the beast, isn't it?
yeah, for sure.
Well, Dustin, it's been an absolute pleasure. And look, I hope people come to your page and if nothing else, give you some support there, follow
Appreciate it, man.
you, keep picking your page and your brain for all these
Please.
tidbits. And guys, if you need a program, a legit program, and I know most of us will do better with a little bit of guidance. We do better when we have something that's laid out for us that just will make sense after we do it for whatever 8 weeks or couple months or a year. Get yourself into Dustin's DMs. Let him know that
Please.
you found him here, and yeah, pick up some tidbits and let's all get stronger before we're not getting stronger.
Yeah. Well, Josh, I really appreciate that, man. Thank you for the shout out. Thanks for having me on. And yeah, so if anybody has any questions, I'll answer any DM. If you don't follow me, obviously it goes to my like, requesting. So I'll check that every few days just 'cause I forget to do it. But by all means, ask me any questions that you have. I have the free program that you mentioned, which is just an 8-week conditioning only program. I also have a group program that consists of both conditioning and strength work. And that's available through Train Heroic, but that's also on my page. And I do offer one-on-ones as well. So a little bit of everything in there for you.
Awesome. What's your Instagram handle again?
It's just my first and last name. So at Lebel, all lowercase, all one word.
Put it all in the show notes. And yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for joining me. And I'll circle back and see how it's all going and let you know how my cardio improves
Please
over the
do.
next few
Please
weeks.
do.
All right. Thanks,
All right,
Justin.
brother. All right. Thank you.